If only we had their fighting spirit, Hungarians, civilians, said as Britain refused to surrender. June 22, 1940. Across rural Hungary, church bells toll as news spreads. France has fallen. In villages scattered from the Great Plain to the Carpathian foothills, Hungarian civilians gather around radios and whisper a phrase that will echo for years. If only we had their fighting spirit. They're not talking about France. They're talking about Britain's refusal to surrender. 6 weeks of German blitzkrieg have shattered France. 90,000 French soldiers dead. 10 million refugees fleeing south. Now the armistice is signed. But across the English Channel, Winston Churchill announces Britain will fight on alone. In the wheat fields of southern Hungary, in the market squares of Budapest, in farmhouses along the Tisza River, Hungarian civilians hear this news and react in ways no one expected. Their responses reveal something profound about a nation that had already surrendered its courage long before this war began. Maria Kovacs stands outside her cottage in a village near Szeged. She's 38, a widow. Her husband died fighting in the Great War for territories Hungary no longer owns. The evening light falls across fields that once fed a larger nation, before Trianon carved Hungary into pieces. Her neighbour Ferenc bursts through the gate, breathless. "The British, they refuse to surrender." Maria scoffs. "Madness, they'll be crushed by August. The Germans will parade through London just like Paris." Ferenc nods, but his eyes betray something else. Not quite hope. Something more painful than hope. Recognition of what they themselves had lost. That night, Maria hears Churchill's voice on a crackling radio at the schoolteacher's house. She stands outside the window, unauthorized to enter but unable to walk away. The voice is calm, resolute, defiant. "We shall never surrender." For the first time in years, since her husband died, since Trianon destroyed her country's pride, since Hungary bent its knee to survive, Maria feels something stir. Not admiration exactly, something closer to longing. The ache of seeing in others what you've lost in yourself. Ordinary people reshaped by extraordinary courage from afar. Remind us how fragile hope becomes when a nation stops believing in its own strength. If you love exploring these hidden chapters of human resilience, where history isn't just about nations, but about the people watching from the sidelines, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. Across Hungary, from the coffee houses of Budapest to farms along the Danube, people react in ways that split along unexpected lines. The question isn't whether Britain will survive. The question is deeper, more painful. What does a nation without courage feel when it hears another nation refuse to bow? To understand what Hungarians felt hearing Britain's defiance, you must first understand what Hungary had become by 1940, a nation still bleeding from wounds that never healed. The Treaty of Trianon dismembered Hungary, 2/3 of its territory gone. 3 million ethnic Hungarians now living under foreign rule in Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. The proud kingdom reduced to a landlocked remnant of itself. Maria's husband had fought in the Great War, believing in victory. He came home to a country that no longer existed in the form he'd defended. 20 years later, that wound still festers. Hungarian schoolchildren learn geography by memorizing lost territories. Maps on classroom walls show historic Hungary in bold lines, current borders in shame-filled dots. Teachers whisper to each other in staff rooms, "We must bend to survive. Defiance is a luxury for empires, not for the defeated." Priests preach similar sermons. Endurance, not resistance. Acceptance, not pride. God tests us with humility, they say, but everyone knows what they mean. We've already lost, don't lose more. When France collapses in 6 weeks, Hungarians see themselves in that fall. Another European power crushed, carved up, forced to accept terms dictated by Germany. The symmetry is unbearable. A shopkeeper in Debrecen tells his customers, "France lasted 6 weeks. We lasted 4 years and still lost everything. At least they got it over with quickly. Hungary drifts toward Germany, not from ideology, but from exhausted pragmatism. Hitler promises to return lost territories, pieces of Slovakia, Transylvania, slices of the old kingdom Hungarian officials calculate, align with Germany, reclaim some pride, survive another decade. But beneath the official acceptance, beneath the political maneuvering and survival instincts, something else stirs. A question that won't stay buried, whispered in marketplaces and over kitchen tables. We once had courage, didn't we? Before Trianon, before the defeat, before we learned to kneel, we once stood for something. Where did that go? In Budapest's central market, vendors arrange vegetables and debate the unthinkable. "The British are fools," says a butcher, wrapping meat in German-language newspapers, now flooding Hungarian newsstands. They'll be invaded by August, September at the latest. A flower seller agrees. France had the Maginot Line, the largest army in Europe. They lasted 6 weeks. Britain has a channel, and Churchill's speeches give them a month. Across the Danube in Buda, in the elegant coffee houses where aristocrats still pretend the old world survives, the tone is different, but the conclusion similar. It's arrogance, says a count whose family once owned estates in Transylvania. Only an empire can afford such stubbornness. They'll learn what we learned. That defiance without power is just theatre. Government officials in their ministries speak more carefully, aware of German observers. Strategically pointless, says a deputy minister. Britain cannot win alone. They prolong the inevitable. But in workshops, in village squares, in homes where people speak without witnesses, the reaction fractures differently. A blacksmith in Pécs hammers iron and mutters to his apprentice, "If only we had their fighting spirit. Maybe we wouldn't always kneel. Maybe we'd still have our country whole." A midwife in Eger, delivering a baby while church bells announce France's fall, tells the mother, "The British refuse to surrender. It hurts to hear it. It reminds us of courage we lost." A teenage student in Szeged writes in his diary, words he'll never show his teachers. "Today, I learned Britain fights on alone. I cannot explain why this makes my chest tight. I want to admire them. I'm afraid to say it aloud. Afraid someone will ask why Hungary never fought this way." The reactions don't follow predictable patterns. Wealthy aristocrats mock British foolishness. Poor farmers envy British defiance. But some aristocrats feel secret shame. Some farmers call it suicide. What unites them is tension, admiration, battling with shame, hope, wrestling with fear, and underneath it all, a question that cuts, why them and not us? Radios are rare in rural Hungary, a luxury item, taxed heavily, owned by school teachers, priests, the occasional wealthy farmer. When Churchill speaks, villagers gather around the homes of those who have them, pressing close to windows, straining to hear through static and distance. Maria stands outside the school teacher's window on a warm July evening. Inside, a dozen people crowd around the wooden radio cabinet. The BBC's Hungarian service crackles to life. Then Churchill's voice, translated but unmistakable in its resolve, "We shall never surrender." Maria's chest tightens. She doesn't know why. It's just words from a distant island, from a politician she's never met, about a war Hungary hasn't officially joined. But something in that voice, the refusal to accept what everyone knows is coming, reaches across the Carpathians and touches something she thought had died with her husband. "Their finest hour," Churchill says, and Maria feels her throat constrict. In a Budapest cafe, recently frequented by German cultural attachés and Hungarian officials courting favor, the radio broadcast cuts through conversation. The cafe falls silent. A German officer smirks. Hungarian patrons study their coffee cups. But a young waiter, clearing tables, pauses. His hands stop moving. He's listening. At the university, students debate in whispered clusters. Is bravery still bravery if it's doomed? asks a philosophy student. They'll be bombed into submission. What's the point? But his classmate, a literature major, counters, what's the point of anything then? If survival requires surrender, what separates us from animals? In a veterans' hospital in Budapest, a man who lost his leg in the Great War sits by his window. He hears the news from a nurse. Britain fights on alone, against impossible odds. He whispers to himself so quietly the nurse almost misses it. A nation can lose battles and still keep its soul. The emotional shift is subtle but spreading. Britain isn't just a country anymore, it's becoming a mirror. And mirrors have a terrible power. They show you what you are by showing you what you're not. For Hungarians listening to Churchill's defiance, the reflection is almost too painful to bear. By summer 1940, Hungary lives under what historians will politely call authoritarian governance. Regent Miklos Horthy rules with German shadows growing longer each month. Speaking freely isn't illegal exactly, it's just unwise. People learn to self-censor, to read between lines, to say one thing and mean another. Hungarians don't just admire British defiance, they envy it, envy the choice itself. Maria sits at her kitchen table, her husband's photograph watching from the wall. She thinks about his death, 1918, bleeding in a field hospital, dying for a Hungary that would cease to exist 2 years later. He died fighting for a Hungary that no longer fights for itself. She whispers to the empty room. The difference stings. Britain chooses to fight. Hungary never had that choice, or had it stolen so long ago, no one remembers what choosing felt like. A school teacher in Miskolc writes in her diary, words she hides under floorboards. The children ask about Britain. They admire Churchill without knowing why. Parents envy the British without admitting it. Only officials pretend not to care. But I see it in everyone's eyes. We've become spectators to courage we can no longer summon ourselves. In Szeged, a shoemaker tells customers between heel repairs, we lost our fire after Trianon. 20 years of bending, of accepting, of being realistic. Now we see a nation that refuses to bend, and it shows us what we've become. Government newspapers, their editorial lines increasingly shaped by German pressure, mock British stubbornness. Churchill's folly reads one headline, Island Empire's suicidal pride, declares another. The articles predict imminent British collapse, inevitable German victory. But citizens read between the lines. If Britain's defeat is so certain, why do the papers mention it every day? Why the constant reassurance that Germany will win? A postal worker in Budapest notices something. Letters from relatives in Transylvania mention Britain more than they mention their own lives. Everyone's watching them, he tells his wife, because watching them is easier than looking at ourselves. The envy grows sharper as summer deepens. Britain had everything to lose and chose to fight anyway. Hungary had already lost everything and chose to accept it. Resistance begins small, not with armies or manifestos, but with a radio dial turned secretly at night. The BBC's Hungarian service broadcasts each evening. Listening isn't technically illegal yet, but it's watched. Noted. A farmer in Hódmezővásárhely drapes blankets over his windows. Before turning the dial, his teenage son stands guard at the door. They listen to reports of RAF victories, German bomber losses, British determination. They don't know if it's propaganda. They don't care. They need to hear that somewhere. Someone still fights. In Budapest, a young journalist named István works for a government-approved newspaper. By day, he writes approved stories about Hungarian-German friendship, about British imperial decline by night. He copies BBC broadcasts by hand in a notebook hidden in his desk. He shares the updates at markets, in cafes, disguised as gossip. I heard the British shot down 50 German planes yesterday. Just a rumor, of course. People lean in. They want the rumors. They need them. A farmer near Kecskemét carves words into his barn door with a knife, working by moonlight. A remeni tuleli. Hope survives. His wife begs him to sand it off. The Germans will see, she warns. He leaves it. 3 neighbours carve similar phrases on their own property within a week. Maria begins meeting with other war widows in her village. They gather under the pretense of sewing circles, of canning vegetables for winter, but they talk about Britain, about Churchill's speeches, about what it means that a nation chooses to stand. "My husband died for nothing," one widow says bitterly. "No," Maria replies, surprising herself. "He died because Hungary forgot how to say no. But the British remember, and maybe remembering is contagious." A schoolboy in Eger writes an essay for class. "If Britain can stand alone against Germany, maybe Hungary can stand for something too. Maybe we don't have to bend forever." His teacher reads it twice. She should report it. The safe thing would be to report it. Instead, she hides it in her desk drawer beneath lesson plans and attendance sheets. She's not sure why she protects it, only that the boy wrote something true, and truth has become dangerous enough to preserve. By autumn 1940, Germany's patience with Hungarian ambivalence wears thin. Hitler needs Hungary fully committed, not just diplomatically aligned, but ideologically synchronized. Pressure comes in subtle forms first. German cultural attachés visit universities, schools, newspapers. They don't threaten. They suggest, they remind. They ask why Hungarian papers still mention British resistance. "Surely," they say with practiced smiles, "such news only confuses the public." A bookseller in Budapest receives a visit from Hungarian police accompanied by German observers. His crime: displaying English literature in his shop window, Shakespeare, Dickens, Wilde. "Inappropriate," the police captain says, though his eyes apologize. "Remove them." The bookseller complies. That night, he sells the books quietly to trusted customers, below cost, just to keep them in Hungarian hands. At the University of Debrecen, a history professor mentions Churchill in a lecture, not praising him, simply analyzing his rhetoric. A student reports him not a Nazi sympathizer, just a frightened young man hoping to prove loyalty. The professor is dismissed within a week. No trial, no formal charges, just gone. Officials begin warning that admiring Britain constitutes disloyalty, not to Hungary, but to Hungary's necessary alliance. The distinction matters less each day. Underground whispers grow more careful, but more determined. In a Szeged tobacco shop, men speak in code. "The storm continues" means Britain still fights, "the birds fly north" means RAF victories. "Winter comes early" means, "hold on, things might change." Maria's village priest delivers a Sunday sermon about prudence, about accepting God's will, about not questioning authority, but after the service, he finds Maria outside. "Keep listening," he whispers, "but carefully." His eyes reveal everything his sermon couldn't say. He listens too. September, October, November 1940. The Battle of Britain rages in skies Hungarians will never see. But they hear about it in whispered BBC reports, in the nervous tone of German-approved newspapers, in the fact that Britain still exists. German papers promised invasion by August, then September, then October. Now winter approaches and Britain fights on. Hungarian mood shifts like river currents beneath ice. A mother in Pécs tells her daughter, pointing to the radio, "Listen to them roar. That sound, that's a nation alive. Remember it." A veteran in Budapest, both legs lost in the Great War, sits in his wheelchair and tells visitors, "They stand against the storm, alone, without allies, without hope of easy victory. That is what freedom looks like. We've forgotten. But shame spreads alongside admiration. In markets, in churches, in homes, the question surfaces. Why didn't we resist our fate? Why are we always under someone's shadow?" The answers hurt. Because we were tired. Because Trianon broke us. Because we learned that defiance costs more than we could pay. Because. A factory worker in Miskolc says it plainly, We chose survival over pride. Maybe we were right, maybe we were cowards, maybe both. Maria experiences her own turning point on a November evening. She's listening at the schoolteacher's window again. Churchill speaking about never surrendering, about fighting on beaches and streets and hills. Something crystallizes. She doesn't admire Britain for being strong. Strength is circumstance, luck, geography. She admires them because they refused to stop being themselves. Hungary stopped being itself after Trianon. Became smaller, quieter, more careful. Britain, bombed and besieged, remains defiantly British. Maria walks home through darkness. The wheat fields stretch toward horizons that once held Hungarian towns, now Romanian, now Czechoslovak lost territories, lost pride, lost courage. But tonight, listening to Churchill's voice across 1,000 miles, she thinks, maybe courage isn't lost forever. Maybe it's just sleeping. Maybe it can wake up. If the British can refuse to surrender their souls, perhaps Hungarians can refuse too. By 1941, Britain has become more than a country to Hungarians. It's become a symbol of courage they once possessed, of pride they surrendered, of fire they wish they could reclaim. Maria watches village children play in the wheat fields. They're pretending to be RAF pilots, arms outstretched like wings, making engine sounds, shouting "Never surrender" in broken English learned from older brothers. She whispers to herself, if only we had their fighting spirit, maybe history would have judged us differently. Hungarians weren't cowards. They were wounded, exhausted, reshaped by defeat. 20 years of loss had taught them that resistance costs more than survival. Britain's refusal to surrender didn't just inspire them. It reopened a wound they'd tried to heal by forgetting. But wounds that reopen can also remind you that you're still alive, still capable of feeling, still human beneath the scar tissue. This is the kind of story that challenges how we understand resilience, not as constant strength, but as the capacity to remember what strength feels like. If these hidden chapters of history resonate with you, if you want to explore more moments where ordinary people confronted extraordinary choices, subscribe so you never miss a story. These aren't just history lessons, they're mirrors for our own moments of decision. A shopkeeper in Szeged says it best in late 1941. "The British didn't save us. They couldn't. We were too far away, too entangled, too defeated already. But they lit a lantern, and some of us saw it. Not everyone saw it. Not everyone wanted to. Some Hungarians remained committed to German alliance, to pragmatic survival, to accepting the world as it was rather than fighting for what it could be. But those who saw Britain's defiance, those who let it wound them, inspire them, shame them into remembering, they carried something forward, a small flame in the darkness, a refusal to forget that no was still possible. They didn't know how the war would end. They only knew one nation refused to bow. And sometimes that small fact is enough to awaken 1,000 sleeping hearts.